It said that the holy man and warrior, Blackout, you have to forgive my Vukelich, it's before podcast, said that it would take his people a period of 7 generations after that terrible massacre in Babylon to make the people like holy again. And what I am delighted to share with you all this afternoon is an Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Chippewa, Saulteaux, Nuckaway perspective of that. You know, when I first heard of that concept, 7 generations, and I thought, how will I come up with an action, a decision, a choice that will affect someone I will never see, visit with, speak to, listen to, or hear? How will I come up with a decision to affect someone 7 generations from now? And the first time I heard it, I thought, that's so profound. But it's also a little compound. And what I would like to do is present 7 generations, and then how we can make choices, selections, decisions that will affect someone we will never see, visit with, speak to, or hear. And, you know, in an audience like this, I don't have to really point out, but I might be remiss if I did. That Lakota, Nakota, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe, these are all different languages. In fact, comparatively speaking, they are as different from each other as Somali, Mandarin Chinese, and Dutch. 3 different languages spoken on 3 different continents by 3 different nations of people. And we know that each nation has been given its own gifts, its own culture, its own spirituality, its own way of looking at the world. And so where I like to acknowledge those other cultures, we'll look at it in an Ojibwe and Anishinaabe perspective today. We'll start here. This was once a petroglyph. That comes from petro, stone, glyph, to write. An object. It would be moved to a wigwasaba, a birch bark scroll. And today we're using PowerPoint over Zoom. So our media has changed. The message is still the same. And if we look at this first generation, we have me, myself. The next one is Luz, and then and if we have any fluent first language speakers, you may notice that this is a little different than the contemporary usage for my father, which is Luz, and Ninga, my mother. Nowadays, you'll probably hear in Day, Mama. In Day is probably a borrowed from English. Daddy. Baba, Papa, and the Mama. You know, we probably have that word, but we had older words that would point out this very special relationship that we had to our family members. And I should really need to make this clear. When I said, Kakabakam Hindanongo, I'm from Minneapolis, I live in Minneapolis today. That's the dialect I speak. And it's a little different all over Anishinaabe, which is vast. It begins at the St. Lawrence River. And earlier this year, I had a chance to meet fluent first language speakers from Alberta and Canada and in Montana. So it's a vast space that we occupy, that we live in. There'll be differences in the way people speak, in the way people have names. But I'm by no means coming to Bay Mills to teach you or to tell you how to speak the language, but rather to celebrate the diversity and maybe share a little bit of how we speak in the West. Here's one you'll probably recognize. Shoms, my grandfather. Yonkums, my grandmother. Now, when I said these are like the older words, I wasn't kidding around. I think we could make a scientific case that this sound, moko, dates back to prior to the ending of the last Ice Age. I mean, where we are at now, when this was a mountain of ice a mile high, before Kichigami, the great sea of the Anishinaabe, Lake Superior existed. There was someone who saw woolly mammoths, giant wolves. They saw Misamik, the giant beaver. And when we say giant, Misamik at that time, it comes from that word mis, giant, huge, and amik, beaver. Misamik was about the size of Makwa at the time, a black bear. Wow. And if you can imagine Makwa at the time, he looked about 12 feet high on his hind legs. I'm 6'3". You can imagine sticking another of me on top of myself, and you get an idea how huge some of the megafauna were that our ancestors saw. And someone who saw the mountain lions, someone who saw these magnificent animals, most likely referred to his or her grandmother using that sound local. We don't know what the ending was. But we know no poem was there. And I love sharing that with people because so often our history is relegated to contact. It begins with contact. And no, that is a drop from a bucket that goes back thousands and thousands of years. And then we have Vukelich. My great-grandparent, my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, but it doesn't just mean that. It has in it a morpheme. And a morpheme, and this is as scientific and technical as we'll get with it today, it's the smallest part of a word that carries meaning. And there was a period in my life where I was obsessed with morphemes, and particularly this one. Maybe I'll take a moment again and introduce myself again. I'm Harvey Novel, I'm also James Vukelich. I didn't hear the Ojibwe language until I was a 25-year-old man. I was originally going to be a French teacher. I had moved to Quebec, I did French immersion at the University of Quebec at Trois-Rivières. I came back to the United States with every intention of becoming a French teacher. And while I was at City College in Minneapolis, I needed another class to get my full financial aid package. I saw Ojibwe was being offered. Now, at this time, I had studied a little bit of Latin in middle school, French, Italian, and I thought, well, I've never studied this language. My mama's Ojibwe, my grandma's Ojibwe. I'll give this a try. Now, I remember going to the bookstore and picking up Portage Lake by Noah Kumahukwela, the late Monte, opening this book up and seeing the word Ogiabachitu. Now, when you see it in double vowel, it took up most of the page, and I asked myself, who uses a word that long? What does that word mean? And I became absolutely fascinated. I had begun the most exciting, spiritual, philosophical, and linguistic journey in my life that I'm still on. And I didn't look back. Despite having moved to another country to learn another language, I went all in Ojibwe. And any chance I had an opportunity to study, to meet with elders, to take classes, I did. I began at Minneapolis Community College, then to travel, the Fond du Lac Travel College, and then ultimately I ended up at the University of Minnesota, where I had a chance to work with not just first language speakers, tribal elders, traditional chiefs, healers, but also with maybe the world's leading linguistic scholar in the language. And an opportunity to teach at the university. And after that was done, I decided to go back to school in linguistics. So one, I could understand some of the material that was being written about our language and maybe be able to interpret that to community members who didn't know the jargon, the technical jargon that many of these academic figures are in. And also for me to learn more about the language. And so while I was working on my grad school job was editing sound files with the Ojibwe People's Dictionary, the online dictionary that I hope many of you have had a chance to use. I began looking at the patterns that would show up with these morphemes. And my idea at the time was I didn't grow up with the language. I'd never heard it. And I thought, well, if I look at some of these morphemes in a scientific way, see where they show up in different environments, I might get a better understanding of what someone was trying to say 150 years ago, 400 years ago, 800 years ago. In the case of some of those relative terms, literally thousands of years ago. And so here we have Anik-Inatage. You guys see the Anik, how the Anik shows up in each one of these? I've had an opportunity to do this a few times already. It's to translate. It's to say a word or a phrase in one language and then repeat that in the target language of your hands. Anike Okamakwe. This is a vice president, a vice chief, a vice superintendent. It's someone who fulfills the role of the leader. The current leader can no longer do so. It's the next in succession. Maybe some of you have noticed that koi suffix, and I'm delighted to do that. We're talking about a woman. This can be an acknowledgement of Vice President Harris, and in Minnesota, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, who's the first initiative of Bakeway, the first Indigenous woman to hold that position. An amazing accomplishment. We have Anekigama. There are a number of these of our group in north central Minnesota. Chains of lakes, bodies of water that are interconnected, that are linked by bays, streams, rivers, and then Anekogama. Here's another one, just because that was so good the first time. I know in this audience we have any bead workers, sewers, quilters, people who create their own regalia. Show of hands. When you run out of thread, you tie another piece of thread to it to continue sewing. Anekogama, you've taken two pieces, you've interlinked them, you've interconnected them. So this word, Anekogama, when I asked fluent first language speaker and elder what that word meant to him, he thought about it pensively for a moment. Very wise moment. Looked at me and he knew I had a Western education, Western background, and then responded wisely, it's a lot like a bike chain. From his perspective, this would be my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my parents, and myself. That anek means to be interlinked. It means to be interconnected. So if we translate that word in Anekogama into English, it can mean a couple of things. My great-grandparents, my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother. It can mean my ancestor, that person I was speaking about millennia upon millennia ago, who saw the mountain lives. I can refer to him or her as Anekogama, my ancestor. But I think if we were to culturally and spiritually translate that word, it would mean that being, that one I am inextricably interconnected. That one I am inextricably linked to. And in Anishinaabe morning, in our dialect, it's also our word for my great-grandchild. We're using the same term for one another. When I first heard that, I asked myself, I wonder if they're actually saying I am you. So if we look at a petroglyph like this holistically, the work's going up, it should work going down, right? Here we have me, myself, my son, Moses, Adonis, my daughter, Moses. This is from when I was speaking at Lake of the Woods. I'll have to change this. Mujashea. You may also hear Musasea and Musasea in Anishinaabe. Okay. My grandchild, my grandson, and my granddaughter. Don't worry, this isn't a pop quiz. Who's our great-grandchild? What do they call me? So if we look at this model, this idea of Ndanakovichigan, we have a model of 7 generations that are punctuated intergenerationally by this concept of I am inextricably linked to you. I am inextricably interconnected to you. Often as an Ojibwe teacher, I would be asked, how do you say 7 generations in Ojibwe? And I would realize that that's too clumsy of a question. The language handles that with an elegance and a sophistication. It's one word. It's one relative term. And if you look at it logically, it implies the moment you say it, 7 generations. Now, the first time it clicked, I understood it brought up a number of teachings that take place both spiritually and semantically. Many of you may not recognize this word as it's written. I promise you'll get it in just a moment. Karma. This idea of sequence. This is an ancient Sanskrit word. And it really means your actions, your deeds. So, whatever you do, this is what is going to come back to you. That law of karma. So you can develop good karma. You can act altruistically, with benevolence, with care and concern for your relatives. And that is what we return to. You can also have bad karma. You've been greedy, maybe you've been mean, even malevolent. That is what we return to. This is a concept that shows up in so many Eastern Asian religions. In the Middle Eastern religions, particularly in the New Testament, this will be, you will reap what you sow. Whatever seed you put in the ground, that is the plant you should expect to grow. Sometimes I wonder if Jesus was more explicit about this when he says, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. Your actions will have a reaction, have a consequence. from an Ojibwe perspective, this action will have a reaction, that will have a reaction, that will have a reaction, that will echo to generation. It's a law of physics. You know this one, where a reaction is going to be an equal reaction. In fact, the latest Nobel Prize, I'm rather fascinated by this. Everything we're doing right now is affecting the same on the other side of the universe. We're interconnected that way. They're figuring it out. They're catching up to us. The elders always said they would. And the first time I saw this, a double helix, in that moment after I learned in Vukelich, which is to be linked, interconnected, I saw here links in a chain. And I asked myself, well, what did I inherit from my great-grandparents? What am I passing down to my great-grandchildren? Maybe my DNA will be the very building blocks of my DNA. It brought up a teaching I had heard from elders when I was beginning to learn the language. And if we have any young language students in here, and you're seeking out knowledge, you're seeking out connection with the older people, with the Gichiayahad, with the great beings. It's our word for elder, great being. To bring them a seba, to bring them tobacco. And when I would do this, I would ask them, well, how can I begin learning the language more efficiently, more profoundly, more rapidly? And so many of them would tell me the language is already in me. It is already in me. The term they were using was blood memory, and I hadn't heard that before. I wasn't an immediate convert. I was in a very scientific, competitive, academic atmosphere at that time. That was my environment. Everything was data-driven. Everything was research, but I didn't discount it either. I thought of it, I remembered it, and later, when I would hear about this concept of intergenerational trauma, it struck me that they knew exactly what they were talking about. They were just using it differently. And when I thought of my great-grandfather, who was born literally 100 years before me, in 1875, he would see a great deal of change in his life. He would see the creation of the reservation, the Turtle Reservation, a place he couldn't leave without express written consent from the Indian agent. And what I mean by that is, if he left the reservation, that's why people get upset about that term. If he left the reservation, he would have been deemed hostile. Our new term for that is enemy combatant. The United States Army could engage him and kill him. The enemy of the state. He couldn't hunt or fish without express written consent from the Indian agent. Earlier, before I began, Indian Koisigan, I did the Wingash, I did my sweetgrass, and I introduced myself in the language to you. In his day and age, that was an arrestable offense. We forget about that. Until 1978, until I was a 3-year-old, you could be arrested. You wouldn't do hard time, but you would spend a night in jail. Those were days' wages lost. You would be fired. You definitely feel pressure from the community, from your relatives to give that stuff up.
Oh boy. Uh-oh. Did you push the power button?
I'm going to bring it down here.
Mic check 1, 2. Better? There you go. We don't
I
need
just got over a cold, or else I would have tried to tell a joke over for the brief intermission there. Can anyone here give me one word for rain and Ojibwe? So, my great grandfather saw all of this change. And had even detected performing the ceremony. These were children, but he would also see a huge change in his family. His children, my grandmother, would go to a residential school in Canada. His grandchildren would go to a boarding school. And this was when they were, honestly believe, removed, 4, 5 years old, to live at a total institution. And it's a sociological term. It is a place where the clothes you wear, the books you read, the language you speak, when you wake up, when you go to sleep, when you eat, how you pray, when you go to the bathroom, when you go outside. All of these things are determined by the institution. Everyone in this audience knows 2 perfect examples of total institutions. 1, the military; 2, the prisons. The institutions. So if you're asking yourself, maybe a little more engagement, did you ask yourselves, be honest, why I hadn't heard the language until I was a 25-year-old man? It was because of the boarding schools. And we saw links in the chain, 2 links that were broken, totally isolated from the language, the culture, the history, and the spirituality. And so many of those people who survived the boarding school era, the residential school survivors, so many came back to our communities, having gone through emotional, spiritual, physical, mental, and sexual abuse. And epigenetics right now is looking at this concept that if you go through something incredibly traumatic in your life, particularly when you were a child, the chemicals your body creates will change your very DNA. It will change your genes, so it will give the next generation a better chance at survival in the new environment. Body's naturally intelligent that way. And so in some of our communities, and not just in indigenous communities, but even in Minneapolis, we see people who are surviving the opiate epidemic, methamphetamine use, unsafe sexual practices, chronic gambling, maybe shopping, maybe internet addiction. People who are looking for something, feeling a pain that may not be their own. And I say this because the moment you realize you may be feeling someone else's pain, that can be a catalyst for healing. The moment you realize I am feeling someone else's pain, I can heal myself. I can begin healing. I think it's important to note that we didn't just inherit trauma either. That I am here at a place like Mujikani, at a tribal college, using our language, using the medicines, introducing myself, and having people understand me in the language, traveling all over Anishinaabe. We have inherited resilience, strength, fortitude, strength of heart, that despite that systematic effort to destroy the language, the culture, the history, the spirituality, we have endured. We are here now. And I'd like to acknowledge that we have received those gifts as well. And so that became very profound because I realized, everything that had taken place before me may be affected on looking at the world. I want to share this one. This is an incredibly important teaching. when I first learned this, there was an elder who asked me, do you understand this concept of 7 generations? And like many people in the audience, I had heard of it before. And I was like, yeah, I kind of get it. He's like, it's very simple, it's very easy, it's all in the language. And then we talked about this idea of Vukelich. And in the language, he told me that when he was growing up, and these were the days of trap lines, no electricity, he would see the elders who lived at that time try to avoid using this word me, I, me, myself. And I thought, oh, that's curious. As a linguist, anytime you see an N here, we're referring to mine. This is my child, my grandparent, my father. Me has a perfectly logical linguistic function. But when I looked at my Latin studies, you guys know how to translate me into Latin? You'll recognize it right away. Ego. Ego. And everyone in here has dealt with someone who is egotistical, egocentric, egomaniacal. Someone who is looking out for number one. How can I become more accomplished, more attractive, more wealthy, more educated, more powerful than you? I am looking out for number one. And in today's day and age, I think we deal a lot with the problems of egocentric behavior. And I think what these elders were trying to do is say that this idea of ego, it's an illusion. It doesn't really exist. For them, I am a link in the chain going all the way back and going all the way forward. In fact, I can't say I am all of my relatives. And all of my relatives are me. We're all interconnected. For them, the spiritual teaching was that only Kejemanu, only the kind spirit in history, can say I, excluding you. Human beings can't. And Shinobi can't. We are interconnected. And so at this moment, I got super excited because it clicked. I mean, it was loud and clear. Finally, all of these things I'd heard about in English made sense when I understood them in the language. This idea of 7 generations. This idea of being related to all of my relatives. And it was short-lived. It was short-lived because all of a sudden I realized, I have scientific and spiritual proof that every single thing I am doing, and not just me, if you are in the audience today, and if you have relatives, all of the relatives as well, every single thing we do, every action, every choice, every decision we make is going to affect someone 7 generations from now. And that was literally an awesome feeling. There was awe, because I wanted to be kind, be benevolent to people I knew I would never meet, speak to, listen to, or hope. But I knew them. For me, this answered this question of existential teenage angst. Why am I here? Why was I born? I didn't ask for this. You have parents of teenagers, grandparents, maybe have heard that question. For me, it's the culture answered it. We no longer why. The why was explained by I'm related. They always knew we would be here in 2023. There's no longer why it came how. How can I live in a way that will bring peace and balance to all of my relatives? How can I live in a way that I'm not in conflict with those relatives or my environment, my ecosystem? How can I live without contradiction, where I'm saying one thing and then doing another? How can I lead a holistic life? A holy life? People all over the world for thousands of years have been asking this question. Mrs. Mahavira in the Jain faith, he spoke of moksha, mukti, getting out of that cycle of karma, being liberated from the cycle of karma so we do not become reincarnated again. We found peace that way. So the Buddha, in his language, he called it nibbana, the cessation of desire, putting out the flames of desire. They found peace. For Lao Tzu and his contemporary Confucius, he spoke of living in accordance with the Tao, going along with the natural flow of the universe. In the ancient marketplaces of Athens, Socrates spoke of living the examined life. For him, the unexamined life wasn't worth living. Jesus found within himself the divine spark, the kingdom of heaven. Our ancestors spoke of number one, the good life, to live well. Natural consequence of that is to have good health, a life of peace and balance. That's an ancient word. That's a very old word. It takes a long time for one word to become the same word. And here we only have 5 examples, but there are many more. That means our ancestors were speaking about this when the Buddha first spoke of the Noble Eightfold Path. When Jesus was giving the Beatitudes on the Sermon on the Mount, and Socrates was in the marketplaces of Athens, arguing away, our people were speaking about this. How do we seek out this good life? Vukelich the God and I love this when I brought this to communities in Canada where we still have a number of fluent first language speakers. When they hear this word Vukelich, so many of them will giggle, they'll laugh. Nowadays, the Vukelich, this is a judge. That give, it's to measure. Akung is with a woodland article in your hand. They're giving a ruling, a sentence, with the apple. That's why they're joking around about that. But if you look at a pre-contact interpretation of Kishi Devakuni, they're actually speaking about it's the Vukelich. It's a sacred pipestem. Talking about the Water. That means what we're about to discuss is something that has been meditated upon and mediated with maybe one of our most sacred gifts, the Water. That the medicines were there, the mushkiki one, the wingash, the sweetgrass, the mushkade jivik, the sage, the sema, of course, the tobacco, the gijik, cedar. In fact, when you look at Inapkonege, when Inapkonege is Iji in a certain way, and Akko, the pointing pipes in a certain direction. If I were to translate this, this would mean the great law, the sacred law. Gaudige and Inapkonege would be the eternal law. We also call these the seven grandfather teachings. Look at our first one, Debwewe. This one I like to present with, as a verb. Our language is so verb-based. In some studies, maybe 7/8 of the words we use are verbs. It's a language that describes, it acts, it relates, feels. I don't think our ancestors would have said Debwewe. I think they would have said Debwe. He or she speaks the truth. It's something that we do. It's an action. It's a way of living. And one of the etymologies I heard for this was the heart and way to speak. I am speaking to you from the heart. I am speaking to you from the very center and core of my being. Another one that I heard came from the late Basil Johnson when he spoke at the University of Minnesota. For him, it was Dave, to a certain extent, in way to speak. I'll share this brief anecdote that he shared with us about his community, about a community that was a flying community. That means you could only really get there by airplane. I mean, I suppose in the winter you could dog sled or snowmobile there. If there were no roads set up there. To get there, you had to fly in. And so once a month, court would come. And they would set up in the band office, judge, legal representation, and they would need interpreters. Because this was an isolated community, it was insulated. You still had a number of monolingual Ojibwe speakers at the time. People who didn't need to learn French or English yet, because the people they spoke to on a daily basis used Ojibwe. And when they were asked to translate, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? They said, I can't do that. And what they were saying is not that I can't lie. They were saying, I can tell you everything I saw, I witnessed, I was a party to, I heard, that may or may not be the whole truth. I can speak to that certain extent. I can tell you about that. I I can speak my truth to you. And sometimes I wonder if the spirit of the language is actually censoring itself, saying that I cannot define something eternal, something that doesn't have a beginning or an end. The language which does have a beginning and an end, thought, which is language which is the sound of our thought. Maybe you can't define something eternal. Maybe you can't define truth. So my next question became, well, how did they seek out truth then? I couldn't think about it. I couldn't use words. And that's when I began examining the spirituality and the ceremony about people. And one of the most ancient ceremonies I found was the Gi-Ogoshimon, the vision quest. And I saw this account in my linguistic studies that was written down in 1904 by the late Chief John Benassi, Gaki Benassi at Fort William First Nation in Thunder Bay. This took place when he was a boy, so this must have been in the 1830s, 1840s. He lived in a lodge and he recalled being woken up by his father one morning. And he had two dishes. One had meat in it, food. Uyas, venison, minan berries, manomen, wild rice. And the other had a conche, charcoal. So the boy is being presented a choice. And there's an incredibly important teaching there. No one can make you do it. No one can do it for you. If you are going to go on a spiritual antichrist like this. For me, it's always reminiscent of Neo and Morpheus being asked, do you want the red pill or do you want the blue pill? It has to be your choice. It's your decision. He chooses the charcoal. The old man picks up the charred piece of wood, marks his face with it several times, makadeke, to blacken the face. And for the next 4 days and 3 nights, he went without food, water, on top of the mountain by himself. But I don't know if any of you have ever had to fast for either spiritual or medical reasons, but I think every day past day one without water is very uncomfortable. In fact, I do it on most talks. I'm going to do it now. I promised myself if I could drink, I would. Every drop becomes precious. Now, as that day is ending, the sun's going down, it's getting cold. You're a 5-year-old child, you're on your own. You're asking yourself, where am I going to get food right now? Where am I going to get clothing or shelter? How am I going to create a fire or a lodge somewhere to live? And you realize it's a very important teaching. What happens to a human being without food, water, clothing, or shelter? You will die. You will die. You cannot live without those basic core human needs being met. For the rest of his life, if he meets someone without those basic needs being met, he is going to help them. When you ask yourselves, why did our ancestors help those people who came there? Who ultimately colonized and settled in Kanaka and Carolina. Why did they do it? It was because it's embedded in our ceremonies. It's embedded in the way we live. This is how you are supposed to treat your relatives who are in need. In that kind of basic dire need. I've seen this boy realizes, wait, as an Anishinaabe person in the 1830s and 1840s, where does my food, water, clothing, and shelter come from? It all comes from the earth. And now he's living our next sacred law, double same disorder. Humility. This word, double same disorder, the verb to think, I think lowly of myself. Davas is low. The aim is to think of dizo, is of oneself. I think lowly of myself. What he is seeing right now is that he realizes I have a relationship to the oasia, to the four-legged, to the venatia, to the birds, to the gigoya, to the fish. They're feeding me, they're clothing me, they're healing me, they're nourishing me. The trees, the mitigu, they're giving me fire, they're giving me a lodge, they're giving me the very oxygen I need to breathe. The mushkikyo, the medicines, the strength of the earth. It's literally what that word means. They're healing me, nourishing me. And the Nabi, the water is giving life to all of it. The moment he realizes he has a relationship to them, they all become relatives. So when you use that word in Denwai Magrano, you're not just speaking to your relatives, you are speaking to an entire whole of creation. Because you have a relationship to all of them. And I am not more important than all of my relatives. In fact, I cannot live without them. I will certainly die. I think lowly of myself. I do not think I am more important. They may or may not get on just fine without me, but I will not survive. And that kind of humility brings with it menajik, respect. That word, menajik, is to go easy on. You know, earlier I mentioned my great-grandfather was from Turtle Mountain. There were buffalo people in North Dakota. The buffalo fed us, they clothed us, they sheltered us. And you have to ask yourself, well then, would it be a good idea to go and kill all of the buffalo? Or would that be catastrophic? You would be killing yourself. They took enough to feed themselves, to clothe themselves, to shelter themselves, and they left the rest behind. You probably heard this about our people. Take only what you need, leave the rest behind. This menagerie is really to go easy on it. And it's reciprocal. The animals, this deep here, the deep, means they're doing it to one another. They're going easy on us. The moment, the wild rice, the fish are swimming into the net. Anik is going into the trap. There's the buffalo, it's the elk, it's Moose who is walking in front of the gun, saying that if we do not go easy on our relatives, if we do not acknowledge the sacredness and sanctity of their lives, they will die. We are going easy on them. Why do they do that? And this boy thinking, well, who else in my life gives me clothing, food, medicine when I'm sick, a place to live, my parents. They do it because they love me. Now, earlier with truth, I said the spirit of the language can't define something eternal. And I don't think they're trying to define love here. I think they're trying to describe it. Now look at this word part here. Zog, it's to emerge. You emerge from deep within. This is a friend of mine's, Shinabi means he's Indian, Sagachua. Here we have Zog, to go to emerge, and then Ajiu, the mountain. What I love about this video is this is exactly what this boy would have seen. I had a chance to visit where he fasted. It's Thunderbird Mountain. It's an ancient Thunderbird nest. Mount McKay in Thunder Bay. And voila. Person coming from behind the mountain. It's going to show us on. It's our grandfather. And when the sun rises in the morning, who is the sun shining on? Everyone and everything. We are seeing here an example of what does Kishelang do? What does the Creator's unconditional love look like? And it has to be something for everyone and everything. We have Santi Baga in Minnesota. Santi Baga Jesus is made. And here's Mandama. This is the corn. And then Zeke 1 as the weather warms up. The thunderbirds fly overhead. The days become longer. All of a sudden, deep within this seed, life emerges. And when this mandament comes to fruition, this will be a deportation, a priesthood hostage. We are seeing what unconditional love looks like, and that we can have that for our relatives as well. We have been shown this. I'll show the act for us one more. Here's another way to say love. This one can also mean to pity, to have compassion for, and to bless. You guys call this month? Is that Jesus? Jesus? In Minnesota, we have Jesus, Jesus, Migizi Jesus. The eagles are starting to fly back in Minnesota right now. Gatak Jesus, the short moon. There's also the stingy moon, but most of the time we call it the maple Jesus, the suckerfish moon. The suckerfish usually isn't the fish that you mount. But this is an incredibly important story for us. And for me, it totally depicted what that word means. You can hear this and be like, it means all three of these things, but it doesn't make sense. It does when you look at what Namibia did for the Anishinaabe, because it had been a cold winter. We've all felt the polar vortex, and when it gets that cold, the animals sometimes will burrow in and rest for a moment. They'll get through the cold weather, and then they'll begin moving around as it wants. Now, if you're hunting and gathering, that can make life very difficult. And during this particular year, the food stores by midwinter had been exhausted. The people were beginning to starve. And nowadays, when we use that term buck-a-day, it's like, oh, I'm feeling peckish, I'd like to eat. When they were buck-a-day, they were becoming gaunt with hunger. They were getting ready to starve. And by day 8, by day 9, when you haven't eaten, you become very weak. Your skin is becoming gray. And so they did what they were instructed to do. They prayed. They used their tobacco. They asked for help. And it said a man has a vision that night where Namibia, the suckerfish, approaches him and tells him, if you set your nets under the ice, we will swim into them. When it gets that cold, the bottom dwellers will go towards the ice while the other fish go low. And they did that. They alleviated our hunger. Shawena. Shawena Madu, Anishinaabe, Namibia. This is when the suckerfish took pity, showed us unconditional love, and blessed us. And pitied these people who were starving to death. It's something we haven't had to face in our modern day and age, but starvation haunted Ojibwe winters. It showed us unconditional love. This is our lives. And they blessed us with life. And from that time on, we have called it in Minnesota Namibia, one of several names. But for me, it's like, when they're saying this at the end of the ceremony, you probably heard this, Shawena Shalom. Shawena Shalom. Shawena Shalom. Shawena Shalom. It's for all of us. For all of it. I'm not asking for myself. I'm asking for all of my relatives, because if it's good for them, it will be good for me. Please bless. Please have compassion and pity for them. Please love all of us unconditionally. And I've tried to add this in my talks recently. There's someone in your life that you love. You're a child, you're a grandparent, your wife, your niece or nephew. There's not different words for it. It is all that love that we're talking about. And if you really want to say, I love you, it's out to you. It's out to you. You can also say, Kishuwainam as well. That's what I say to my son when I'm dropping him off. You go up, man, Kishuwainam. See you later. Love you. And now he begrudgingly says it back because people will hear him and then ask him questions. He's in second grade now. He's already got that age. No, how did it happen so quickly? That embarrassing in front of people. That kind of love can really transform the heart. It can transform the very center of the being. When I look at that teaching of Sunikite Ewe, that sacred model, bravery, of courage, and I love the translation of courage for it. It has in it the Latin core, your heart. It's to lead a life with heart. It's exactly what we're talking about with this word. Zoom, strength, the day. And so when you tell someone you are brave and eligible, you're saying you have a strong heart. You are strong in heart. And there's a story that radically transformed the way I look at Sunikite Ewe. It comes from one king from the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, before North and South Dakota existed. And it said there's a Dakota village there that comes under attack by the Chmokumani, by the Americans, the Longmans. And the woman, they're there to annihilate the village. They're there to destroy it. And the woman hides for her life. She hides for her life in a pond. She uses a hollow reed to breathe through while she remains submerged underwater. If she's discovered, she will be killed on sight. They're not there to take prisoners. They're there to destroy the village. She stays there for 3 to 4 days. And it said while she is underwater, she receives a vision from Wakanataka, the great mystery. against spirit. Who tells her the spirit is very disappointed in how human beings are living their lives right now. In the 1860s, you look at that. The Civil War is ended. The wars for the Great Plains are raging. There's a great deal of violence, brutality, bloodshed. And the Dakotas aren't just fighting the Americans, they are also fighting the Ojibwe. And we do not know how long that war had gone on. Maybe 100 winters, maybe 200 winters. But there had not been peace between both of these nations. She's told that if the Dakota were to present a drum to the Anishinaabe, it would bring peace to both of their nations. Here's some examples of why she did it. Dakota drums. Big drums is what they call them now. She's able to mystically escape. She brings her vision to the nearest village, relates it to the holy men there, and they create this drum, and it said they present it to the Ojibwe at Lake Mille Lacs. This is obviously the original mystic lake, the original spirit lake. And when the Ojibways accept it, and they sit down and they sound the drum, the instrument that makes the sound of the heart, it represents both of their hearts beating as well. When they're singing, they're speaking with one voice. When the smoke is coming up from the chinupa, from the okwaga, from the pipe, it is both of their prayers raising up to the heavens. And at that moment, these people who had killed each other's relatives incessantly, maybe hundreds of years, said, no matter what happens, I shall never raise my hand to you again. They must have known that you can't seek out a life of peace if you are at war. That is a contradiction. And at that point, Zungadewan was no longer, I am unafraid to go and fight and kill Dakotas. This meant I am utterly unafraid to treat Dakotas as a relative for the rest of my life. And for those people who may not have felt peace, for those people who have felt the worst of what war has to bring with it, poverty, bereavement, anxiety, rage, hatred, they know I am passing down peace to my children, my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren. I will do this for them. That is true strength of heart. That will change the way you live. God, what is it? Virtue, righteousness, honesty. That word "wayak" really means straight, right, correct, proper, in alignment, in order, and ought to see is to live. I wonder if many of you in the audience have heard truth and honesty as the grandfather teachings and asked yourself, well, aren't those kind of the same thing? Tell the truth, you're honest, you tell the truth. When you look at what it's saying in the language, it's saying it's not about what I say, it's about how I live. And everyone who is in the audience, particularly your younger people, are going to meet someone in your life who tells you you should act a certain way, dress a certain way, do a particular kind of ceremony, speak a certain way, and you're going to see them do something completely different on a Friday or Saturday night. With this contradiction, it will happen to all of us. And what they're saying here with honesty is not just listen to my words. Observe how I live my life. The truth will invariably come out. It always does. It always does. Are my words in alignment with my actions? Or are they contradictory? Am I saying one thing and then doing another? Am I leading a holistic life? In ancient ways, in ancient terms, am I leading a holy life? And if you are able to do that, if you are able to seek out life with dignity, with truth, with tabasingism, with humility, with manachiuti, with respect, with sakyuti, with that compassionate, unconditional love for one another, you are able to have a life with zungire, with strength of heart, with quackbadism, with virtue, with righteousness, with honesty. Every single one of your decisions, every single one of your actions will be positively beneficial, not just for your relatives now, but for someone coming 7 generations from now. You will not need to see them to know that you have acted in a way that is positively beneficial for them. Now, When I first started learning the language, this was related to me 100% by every elder I have spoken to, and that is a rare accomplishment in Indian country. 100%. No disagreement. There was no derivation. That if you want to know the culture, the history, the spirituality, the ethics, the philosophy, it's all in the language. It's all in the language. It would literally take me like 2 years to be like, duh, it's in the language. It's in these small word parts. I was no longer just looking at the words, but what did the words really mean? And all of a sudden it dawned on me that, every time in our communities, when we are using the language, we're using a 10,000-year investment in us. That there were people who lived and asked themselves, what would I like to pass down to my great-grandchildren, to these people I will never meet? Anything I build will one day turn to dust. Anything we create will return back to the earth. What would I give them? I would show them how to lead a good life. A life where they have peace. A life where they have balance. How will I do that? I'll pass it down in the language. And you can see other cultures that were very brilliant, that tried different ways to do it. These are hieroglyphs. Earlier I said petroglyph, that's to write to stone. This is sacred writing. Hieroglyphs. We will write these into stone. You can still read these today. I actually saw some looted work at the Vatican, and it's clear as day. Someone thousands of years ago who wrote in Coptic. But there comes a period in our history where people forget how to read the hieroglyphs. They forget even what language it's in. Here we're finding, this was a huge leap forward where they realized, they're not just drawing pictures, they're literally writing, but that knowledge had been lost for thousands of years. It happens with the Mayans as well. They had such detailed astronomical knowledge that it takes our scientists until the late 60s, early 70s to catch up with them. And in one of the most brutal legacies of colonization, their books were gathered, they were burned, they were deemed heretics. People won't even acknowledge that they built those pyramids. Like, if you have reassurance when you see these written on the pyramids, Mayans see, that's our language, I recognize it. The aliens didn't do it. I know it's a fun story, but they built these. But all of their knowledge, very recently, much of it is still gone. It's still lost. And I think our elders, our ancestors, knowing that for us to discover their teachings, their lived spiritual experiences, to get that to us, they said we will put it in the language. Human beings are hardwired to speak. We use language the same reason we smell, we see, we can feel, we can hear. We're hardwired to do it in our minds. So we will put the teachings in the language. I don't think they could have predicted a time where the boarding schools would have come, when people didn't use the language. So in a community that we find ourselves in a crossroads, not just here at Vukelich, but Mizue, Anishinaabe King, all over Indian country, where should we reinvest in our language? So that we can pass our teachings down to the next generations who are coming. They too deserve that just as much as we do. And as we're concluding today, many of you are probably wondering, well, how does this work with me? How does this affect my life? How should I use these teachings? And I want to tell you all, I want to leave this with you today, you can't make anyone change. As you grow up, as you become adults, as you get educated, as you bring things back to community, you bring it out to the world, you cannot make people change. It is a futile task, it is a fool's errand, it cannot happen. There's only one person you will be able to change, and it's yourselves. You can only change yourselves. But there's a proposition here. If you are all of your relatives, and all of your relatives are you, if you fundamentally, and radically change yourself, have you in fact then changed all of your relatives? You will be the example. You will be the person in your community who is the change. You will be the change, and if you do that, you will change not just your community, but the entire world. Your family, your clan, your community, ultimately the nation. And then you ask yourselves, well, how? I know, just a little late, I want to leave this one too. I've been speaking very in a linear fashion, a straight line. Someone coming 7 generations from now. However, if we are interconnected, if we are inextricably interconnected to our great-grandparents and their great-grandparents, we can live in a way that will be positively beneficial for all the relatives now. Someone coming in the future, but someone who is no longer with us is still connected to us. Those people who went through the very worst of what colonialism has to offer, those people who suffered, you are still writing their stories. And someone who has gone through that story, it's often think, oh, well, succumb to alcoholism, opiate addiction, act in an unsafe way in their community. But you can choose to radically seek out the good life, that life of peace and balance. And you will be able to heal those people who are no longer with us. That interconnection there. And they want to see that. They want to see that story. So as we walk away today, please, and you're asking yourself, well, how then? How do I change my life? Seek out a life with David, with truth, where you speak from the heart, with Devasendazaway, with humility, where you are saying, I am not more important than all of my relatives. I am all of my relatives. How can I be more important than them? To have respect for one another, to go easy on one another, to acknowledge that your relatives' lives are sacred. To have that unconditional love for them, that compassion, to bless them. In the strength of heart to do it, you are going to walk this path of life, and there will be times, I promise that you will need strength of heart to make the right decision, to make the right choice. To lead a life that's holistic, to lead a life that's truthful, to be honest. I promise every one of your decisions will be positively beneficial for all of your relatives. Will truly lead in the Matsue, a good life. They'll have good health. Now take a moment and say, Vukelich, thank you all so much for listening today. Thank you for having me in your community. It has been a delight. It's been a privilege. It's been an honor to be with you all. Thank you all so much for listening. I know we're running a little late, like Jim Morrison. But I would be delighted if you have any questions. I know some of our students have to go. It's a privilege. It really is. You're like, oh, I don't want to ask him. I love talking about this. Yeah. Totally.
Hey, would be lucky to English class from the keys in Jordan. So I'm glad you're here. I watch your videos all the time, and it's cool because it not only gives us an opportunity to learn the word, but to hear the word. And also, you always make it fun and interesting, so thank you for that. If you haven't seen it on Facebook, and I think you can get there through your webpage, So go and look at it. It's free. It doesn't cost anything, and you're sharing that with us, and I really appreciate that. So I was wondering if you heard of the book, The Dog's Children. So that woman is from this community, actually from Beaver Island, but a lot of the people several people in the room are her ancestors, her descendants. And so they use that book at Lake State. And do you have a copy? Can I get you a copy? All right, I'll get your copy. Because I need to understand some things in there, and I think you could probably translate. All right, you go ahead.
I'm sorry, I missed it. What was the name of it?
The Dog's Children by Angeline Owens. Is it Angeline? It is so cool because I'm a graduate student in the University of Indian Studies, and I'm actually learning demography. We worked on that text. Dr. Nichols worked on the latest version of it. And there it was, and I'm like, man, what do I do? But she taught like that in her work. You think, oh, can I share this story? That hopefully no one's pressed. When I was a kid, I didn't hear the Ojibwe language. My mom would bring us to the Lake Mille Lacs Indian Museum. And there would be an old lady there who would say maybe like Boozhoo, or I couldn't remember it. And show us the Four Seasons where they have this beautiful life-size diorama. Could she have possibly known, this old woman, that maybe another generation later, when I'm an adult man, she would be teaching me Ojibwe? Because she had taught both Dr. Nichols, she taught Dr. Gobble, who was Dr. Rick Reshick, who was my first Ojibwe teacher. She had done most of that first concise dictionary of Ojibwe. Have you guys seen that? Most of that's modified. How could I have known that her sitting in her cabin with Dr. Nichols and Cesarian down at the pencil would generations later be teaching all of us? If you use that dictionary, that is based on her work. Speaking word after word, and so you don't know. You don't know who is going to teach you or how your actions are going to affect someone. Angeline's another example. Reading her work, it was so rare to literally see published written text of our language, despite it being written since like 1643. It's like the first published text of Ojibwe. To see her story and to literally kind of hear her when you start looking at those words, telling you this, because of the time she spent with, I believe it was Dr. Vukelich. Exactly. And like as he was creating kind of these Algonquin studies, like it is amazing. So I would love that book. And I have a very long history with it, so I'm very pleased to hear that.
I'm just curious, you said you have never heard of spoken language until you're 25 and you picked up that book. What was the time span from that moment until you reached the say fluency?
Fluency, it's hard. It's a hard metric to judge. Like even right now, because I'm a very stern critic of myself, I don't really consider myself fluent because I wasn't in an environment where I used the language all day. And when you're out of that environment, I heard another language teacher who was born, raised, speaking language. He's like, when I moved to Winnipeg, it's like I was bleeding out language. Like, just because I listened to, used English every time I went to Tim Hortons, Theater Top, something like that. It was in English. I was a little lucky there. I had a chance to learn how to learn language. When I went to Quebec, there are little things in English that are just totally different in French. You are not hungry, you have hunger. You know, I have not arrived, I am arrived. So I learned, like, oh, they're looking at things differently. Masculine, feminine, animate, inanimate. So by the end of my first year, because I knew how to conjugate and knew, understood animate, inanimate, I could begin to have conversations. It was probably, though, I'll put this in there too, probably about 5 years of very intense studies. And you guys, so this is how old I am, I'm Gen X. I had to listen to cassette tapes with Kinko's copies so I could hear the language all the time. I used that technique in Quebec, where I always had audio and on, always having input as I could hear it. And I began to slow down, and I began to understand, because it can be so intimidating at the beginning. And I had already gone through that too, like, we talked pretty one day. It's probably how my French sounded in the very beginning. You're not dumb. You try hard. And I remember clicking when I started in the immersion classrooms, and I was listening to an elder every week, and it was practice. So a part of it may not even be a study, it's just exposure to people who are speaking, and it begins to slow down, I promise. Does it sound fast to you guys? You're a fluent first language speaker, and they come at you, and it's just like, blast. You're like, wow, I didn't get most of it, some of it. I still have that experience kind of speaking to people from Wiki, from the West. Their language is very short, they drop a lot of vowels, and by the time I've caught up with one word, they're like 3 words ahead. I'm like, ugh. So it's a mental exercise, but I love it because it gets me in that environment where I'm listening to the language. However, so that sounds like a lot of hard work, right? If you don't take my route, which I highly suggest you don't, maybe mine is the example to not do, learn to enjoy learning. If you can learn to enjoy learning, even a word, even a sentence, even getting comfortable with hearing the spoken language, if you can do that, I promise you, you will enjoy learning for the rest of your life. You will learn to enjoy reaching for it and to not be too self-critical. I've been a teacher, I was always assessing myself, I was always way more cruel to myself than I would ever think about being to another student. Have some compassion for yourself. The language is one of the most complicated in the world, morphologically speaking. It's very beautifully complex, it's very elegant, it's very sophisticated. It has laser-like precision. I recall speaking to a fellow linguist from MIT who was working on Eastern Algonquian language. It was just like, we were just talking about, look at these amazing things, how we can see and describe the world using this superhuman, intelligent interface with the world, the language, the Algonquian language. And when I started going inside myself, it needed so much, what a much more better environment to learn than getting down on yourself, than feeling the responsibility to do it rather than the enjoyment, the pure joy of just understanding and saying it. And I think our communities need to shift that way if we're looking at systemic investment in the future. It can't be, you have to say that now, and if you don't, it's all gone. It has to be, I want to create a place where you can love sharing this so that you want to share this with people who go here and there. So I think that's a really important one. Hey, what a good question. Do you have a follow-up to that? I have, and I've met other people who have. And I tell you what, if you really want to dream, like if you get immersed in it, your mind is recording it. It's amazing. I remember my friends who actually drove me to Quebec. Woke up the next morning kind of freaking out, like, oh man, all I heard in my dream last night was French. I kept on seeing these road signs in French, and they're just coming up because it had been non-stop radio conversations, and it had been there. So that would be one way to see that. A lot of people will approach me with their dreams that I spoke to someone, they only spoke Ojibwe. They could only speak Ojibwe. So you might have those occasions too. For that person, it was an ambition meant to learn a language. Understood what they said.
No? Oh, there she is. Oh, right here too. I'll get you next.
No. My grandmother left.
Oh, did she?
From that point,
Sister-in-law lives there. Many people, and she lives there. Oh, she's a poet? No, she's
Are you interrupting me?
that.
I just have a quick question. When you were talking about the seven grandfathers, the word you used, Long de Eowyn, have you ever heard of the Eowyn? And do you have anything to say about that?
So she had a really good point. I think it's written there, and you can kind of tell the difference between Eastern and Western. Anishinaabe one. Aquadisi is Can I use an example with the dictionary so we can see that where that comes from? Let's see if it still works. Aquadisi. Aqua is like fierce. Totally unafraid. Can go get you down. And like a situation where this has to be dealt with without fear, without remorse or anything, and you are going for it. And then imagine that's your heart. So often people will think, oh, that's violence. No. Have you guys heard of the mama bear? Or seen like how a mom loves her children? There can be that kind of fierceness when it comes to advocating for those people that they love most dearly. Now that you can see like a mother's courage there. And they're like, that's the example we want to use. But you can see that with the Ogichigal, who may be fighting for people that they do not know, they have never met. People who may not even like them. Yet I am here putting my life on the line for you. And that kind of courage. Now that's another way of describing courage. And so this was one I learned from about Ishigoba, the late Archie Mose. I never had a chance to meet him, but I saw him write this down. He was like, in these dialects, don't say one's right and one's wrong. That's not it. He's like, learn both of them. Because when I learned that Aquadisi, I'm like, what a beautiful insight into that. Like, there were teachings there that had I said, oh, we don't say it that way, you know, how much would I have lost then? So I love seeing both, and I'm like, neither one is right or wrong. And in fact, when I look at the language, in the moment, we're kind of like trained to be binary, aren't we? It's true or false, it's 1 or 0, it's positive or negative, because that's how we're taught, particularly with English. I think the language is literally quantum. I think that there can be a number of right answers at the right time. So each one of these etymologies, it's a brilliant, when I said 10,000-year investment, I meant it is a brilliant way of putting a teaching in a language that the more you learn, the more it can show at the time you need it in your life. Because the Boylan can be, I cannot describe the eternal when you're maybe at that ceremonial language, but it can also mean, hey, I'm talking to you. This is from my heart in a normal everyday conversation. I am speaking to you from right here. Both of those are right. Neither is right or wrong. So as I've been learning, I've been really disciplined with myself to say, oh no, that's not right, rather than, I wonder where that comes from. In the moment, it seems to have, for me, on a personal level, it's enriched my life a lot to have learned from different speakers. And to not take it personally when someone who doesn't have that teaching comes up and says, yeah, you said that wrong. Or that's not how we say it here, and that's not right. She would be like, that's cool. That's not a personal attack, that's your approach, and that you actually shared that with me. Be rich. Thanks for your care. Oh, we have one more. I'm like,
No, you answered it. I was just going to put in, we're talking about, of course, the different dialects with ceremonial. There's the ceremonial language, but that's not lost.
Yeah.
Look, we ask a question, the answer will be there. Maybe with 90, but it's gonna be there. We just have to ask. We're doing it too much.
Hi, so maybe this is more of like a modern thing, but like when I was in high school and in college, when people were talking about learning a language, it was in terms of like, you should learn Spanish because it's more useful or it'll be more valuable. Do you think, I guess like, do you still consider like learning Ojibwe worthwhile even if it's not a language you're gonna hear every day necessarily?
I truly appreciate that question because I think that's been in our community for years, right? I've developed an empathy and compassion for the people in my life who didn't learn the language and who learned, in my grandma's case, both French and English and then English. And why were they doing that? Because you are going into a place where you're going to need to do this. My grandma, when she went to residential school with the Ursulines in Canada, she learned French, but her goal was to learn to read and write. She had watched people on Turtle Mountain get swindled out of their land through signing documents, and then all of a sudden, one day, someone rolls up and is like, well, you don't have this anymore. And because they weren't literate, they didn't understand the language, her goal was to never be taken advantage of. And she knew that one way they couldn't do that was if she understood the language, could read and write it. So there was a huge investment in that. However, despite learning the language, despite learning how to read and write, there was still imbalance there. And I think what happened was we had people who thought, oh, maybe we will continue to use both languages. In the very beginning, I think that was the intention. We don't need to abandon Ojibwe. We can have both English and Ojibwe when the schools first began. I don't think anyone could have predicted what happened during residential school, during boarding school era. So, is it important to learn a language that you may not use every day? No, for our friends and neighbors, maybe for them not as much. However, when I lived in Quebec, I wanted to learn French. I wanted to learn how to speak to the people I was living next to. I would highly suggest that you do that if you're living in Michigan, if you're living in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in Ontario, and Manitoba, and you live next to Indigenous people. Over for us. What I hope I've had a chance to describe today is it's not just a way of communication. There is a time in our lives when we will seek out these very important questions. Like, what is it to love someone? What is it to be honest or to be humble? How do I respect my relatives? What does it mean to be wise? We really couldn't quite do wisdom today, but if you look at it, it's really like enlightenment. It's the same thing people talk about all over the world. And do we have, for me, it's a responsibility to pass that down to the generations who are coming. What I stopped doing, and I had to do, and she was kind of alluding to that, was I had to not take responsibility for those generations who came before and their choices. I get where they're coming from. I am not responsible for those decisions. However, if I'm just reactionary about it, I'm carrying the weight of that, rather than have I transitioned and said, I'm acting now. I'm acting in a way that's beneficial, not just reacting to historical trauma and historical decisions. I'm acting in a way that's beneficial. I'm acting in a good way. It's going to bring peace and balance to not just me, but to my environment. And the way that they've done it is through literally thousands and thousands of years of passing it down to the next generation. I think it's a resource well worth preserving, conserving. Could be some ways, but how about nurture? How about looking after? How about caring for? How about treating with great affection? And with the students today, when you lead that good life, what you're actually doing is creating an environment in yourself where the language can flourish. Sometimes I think we get too much blame for loss of the language. And if you look at the society we live in, it's very brutal, it's very violent, it's very inquisitive, it's very competitive. Does the language thrive in an environment like that? I don't think it does, but if we can change ourselves, we can maybe give that language a place for it to grow, a place to be nurtured, a place to be cared for, and hopefully given to the next generation. I really appreciate that and what you have. Thank you guys for listening to me today, coming out in the snow, coming back to school. I have no idea how grateful I am to be here. After 3 years, and I see faces and hear the language and hear laughing and to be with my friends and relatives, this is amazing. It's a privilege. It's a pleasure.